So thank you. Thank you, the Odyssey team, for inviting me to speak to you. They had observed at prior events that self-sovereign identity ended up being a common theme among many of your tracks. And so, in fact, although there is a challenge for self-sovereign identity, they felt like most of the challenges had identity issues, and that's why they brought me here. So I'm going to talk about self-sovereign identity from two different perspectives. One is an ideology perspective, and then, what is the architecture? What are we actually trying to do to achieve the results of the ideology? So first, myself, I'm Executive Director of Blockchain Commons. It's a benefit corporation. The idea is, how do we support the infrastructure of the internet? How do we support the commons of security and architecture? He mentioned some of my credentials, but there's more there, and my contact information will be in the slides, all available to you later. So ideology and architecture. First, going to talk about that it's both, okay? We have the ideology to reclaim human dignity and authority in the digital world. This is really important, and we're being challenged by that today. But it's also an emerging architecture of technology to enable that ideology. So there's these two different sides. I'm going to talk first about ideology. So self-sovereign identity is based on the principles of enlightenment and the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's kind of our baseline for where it comes from. It begins with the basic premise that you should control your own identity in regards to your relationships, your interactions with other people, organizations, and things. This does not mean you're a silo. You're not all by yourself in the world. You have these relationships. But you, when it comes to your commitments and your agency, ought to be in control of that. And the reason why is that we all have inherent dignity that is independent of our birthplace, lineage, labels, because we're human beings, and we're all humans all around the world. So digital identity today tends to be administered by centralized authorities, governments, corporations, software platform providers. So you see here the acronym GAFAM. I've seen other variations of it: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. Each of them has a vested interest in managing people both on and offline. And why do they want to do this? Why are they going to all this effort? Well, one of the things is that we as communities need to enforce a social contract, whether or not that's citizenship in a government, our employment, trade, services, etc. But to another extent, it's also to lock out other authorities from changing or profiling or benefiting from this social contract. And this has caused inherent problem that we're trying to solve. So why not these centralized authorities? Part of it is our relationships are changing. We're more and more part of a global civil society. Netherlands, I think, has known this for longer than most countries. You've always been a trading country. You've always depended on your relationships in trade and politics and whatever around the world, that you're not independent of the world. These borders and the nature of the social contract is changing as we're entering into the digital world. We have transnational federations such as the EU, nation states, regional states, Wyoming, Scotland, the Swiss cantons. Indigenous tribes have other borders. There's this indigenous tribe that's half in Canada and half in the United States. As far as they're concerned, they're members of that tribe. It doesn't matter whether or not they were born on one side of the border or not. But even smaller things, we have these, states and megalopoli. There's the greater London area, which has a very different opinion about Brexit than the rest of the country. The San Francisco Bay Area versus, the Trump parts of the United States, etc. But corporations, employment crosses borders as well, and we need to deal with this. Now, one of the things that's happening is that all of these other authorities, the countries, the governments, the regions, the cities, are in the process of renegotiating their sovereignty. So we've kind of seen this with Brexit. They basically, for whatever reason, I think it's kind of stupid, but whatever, Britain has decided to go and renegotiate the relationship of their sovereignty. The problem is that these authorities are ignoring the voice of ordinary people. in these negotiations, and yet the risks to individuals are greater. Okay, Facebook, when it does something wrong, can have a multi-billion-dollar fine, and cost of doing business. As individuals, the amount of harm that we can endure is a lot less. So we have to be particularly careful. Thus, self-sovereign identity gives individuals a voice in these discussions as we renegotiate what it means to be human in a digital world. I first wrote about this in the Path to Self-Sovereign Identity in mid-2016, where this is really kind of the first broad use of the term self-sovereign identity, and I wrote the 10 principles of self-sovereign identity. I'm not going to read this text, but the key things are existence. You should control it. You should be able to access it. It should be transparent. It needs to persist for a long time. It needs to be portable. It needs to be interoperable. It needs to have consent. We really want to minimize the information that is out there and the business necessity and the information that's out there. And we really need to protect the individual. So I'm not going to go into all of these principles, but just to give you a highlight of kind of a couple of them, we'll start with existence, the first principle. So existence, users have an independent existence. They are never wholly digital. I mean, this is the fundamental, the most, in my opinion, important of the 10 principles. We as human beings exist, and we exist independent of whether or not we've got a digital representation. In fact, there's 1.1 billion people in the world who don't even have don't even have any identity in the nations that they're in. They don't have a passport, they're not on the registers, etc., much less a digital representation. But they exist. Our physical existence is this most fundamental fact, and the control over ourself is one of our most fundamental freedoms, our unalienable rights. This is why we have the Bill of Rights of the United States, the UN Charter of Human Rights, etc. These things work reasonably okay in the physical world, but they need to be true in the digital world. Human dignity demands that individuals be treated with respect no matter what system they interact with, whether or not it's a face-to-face interaction or digitally online. Because without that, we become just data in a machine, a problem to be solved. We become digital serfs. We are not. Second principle of self-sovereign identity, control. Users must control their identity, privacy, or celebrity as they prefer. So the second principle is really about your moral authority on your identity. You should always be able to refer to it, update it, correct it, or even hide it. So our digital representations are becoming more and more how we interact in the society. It's not as much anymore that our only interactions are with our neighbors or with our village or our tribal boss. We're communicating with people all around the world. We're part of these tribes of intentional communities of various interests, and we're in usually multiple of these. So civil society and a free society demands we give a voice in how these representations work. Now, to be clear, it's not because we own that data, but because individual human beings are the only valid source for that moral authority. It's not about ownership. We should have the same control over our digital selves as we do for our physical selves. And that's not really true today. This isn't perfect control. It's not complete, but it is us. So as children, we learn the appropriate boundaries. I steal the toy from the other child or whatever, and people go, no, that's not the way you do this. As adults, we're expected to understand them. So we need to have sort of social compacts for what this is. There are limits of self-sovereign identity. It doesn't mean you're in complete control. Identity is really about this two-way thing. Each of you has now a bit of my identity. We have a connection. I know you as participants in this. You know me as a speaker in this. And maybe you can connect it to other things. But every one of those is a slightly different view on identity. But the purpose of self-sovereign identity is to help define the borders by which you can make your own decisions about stuff, and outside to be able to negotiate. But importantly, we need to be able to negotiate as peers, not as a petitioner. We need to be much more equal in the relationship that we're trying to negotiate rather than it coming from a source of power. There's a famous aphorism in the United States: the right to swing your arm ends just where the other man's nose begins. Now, I do want you to take care, I've seen this in a few of the presentations here, identity is not property. So human rights, as opposed to property rights, are universal and indivisible and inalienable. So, what this means is that property has a way of being passed on in whole or split up into little pieces and given to different people. It's surrendered, it's transferred and sold. And that's how property law works and how it thinks. But with identity and a lot of aspects of privacy, it's about these intrinsic rights that can't be taken away from you. So we have to be very careful about that. So the self-sovereign identity technology community over the last couple of years has largely looked very critically whenever we see the word own, or other things that are kind of related to that. Instead, we have used the word control. It may not be perfect, but it's better than own. That we need to control our digital identity as well as our physical selves. So that's two of the principles for self-sovereign identity. I encourage you to take a look at the original white paper and some of the work since on the 10 principles. It's actually my hope in the next year that we might actually as a community come together and update these 10 principles. I published them 4 years ago, and I honestly thought, oh, this is just a first draft. And everybody's saying, oh, we follow the 10 principles. We follow the 10 principles. And I'd like to say, that's great. Do we exactly agree on what that means? Can we make it a little bit better? We can. So another thing is that these principles are an attempt to ensure user control. That's the heart of self-sovereign identity. But they also recognize that digital identity can be a two-edged sword. It can be used for beneficial reasons. It can save money. It can give you, appropriate peer power or whatever. But it can still be used maleficently. We can use it for harm, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So there's this balancing act. So we want to have fairness and accountability. That's part of the reason why we have a social contract. This allows the support of the commons that we're all living together in, the civil society. It helps prevent a variety of different harm to the polity. But we also need to prevent human rights abuses, and we need to be able to have the right to express ourselves and to freely associate. There will be conflicts between these needs. And all in all, when we balance these things, when they're kind of in the same territory, I'm going to err toward the freedom and rights of the individual over the needs of the group. Group can handle lots of harm. Group can deal with certain kinds of problems. Individuals can't. So we have to put the individual first. So I believe that we have to hold the powerful, the bigger bodies, the bodies that can have and support more harm. We have to hold them to account and transparency and all these things. And I think as the power goes lower and lower, the vulnerability becomes higher and higher, we have to have privacy for them. So that's the beginning of the ideology. I'm going to come back to ideology in a minute, but it's kind of like, okay, so you've got these wonderful ideas. How the hell are you going to do that? That's hard. Where do we begin? So, at Rebooting Web of Trust 5 years ago, we tackled a lot of different things, saying, oh, well, we could solve it this way, or we can do these things, and such. But where we decided to really focus on first was in credentials, because this is something that everybody has. Whether or not it's a driver's license or a college degree or the right to drive, et cetera. And it's a real tangled mess. There's these credentials, and there's the authentication that you are the person bearing the credential, and then what authority does that grant you, and what level of policy do you have to support to do those different types of things. But it's a good starting point. So a credential typically has information related to a subject of the credential, the name of the person, the photo. It has information related to the issuer, the Department of Motor Vehicles, MIT, etc. Evidence about how the credential was derived in some fashion, and information related to its usage. So it might have a picture on there so you can go, oh, that, I think, my wonderful biometric tool in my brain says, yeah, that's you. Digital credentials can represent all the same information that a physical credential can. However, it adds some powerful things. We can make it much more tamper-proof, and therefore, in some ways, more trustworthy. Holders can generate presentations with multiple credentials. I can, offer 3 things that I think you care about and not offer all the other ones that I don't think you should have. The credentials can be very rapidly transmitted. They're very convenient, and really an important thing for the digital world, they can establish trust at a distance. All the other things require physical presence. I physically hand you my passport. You physically are looking at me. I'm not in LA, I'm in the Netherlands, okay? That is the difference with a digital credential. So classically, credentials over the last 20 years have been an issuer, a holder, and a verifier who does that, and it's got this progression. The problem is that a lot of digital credentials have been overused. One thing is the overuse of identifiers, things like social security number being used for everything when really all it was intended for was to collect taxes. Everybody here has probably dealt with password hell, where one organization has one rule on passwords, another has the other, and they're all too short. We have personal data and that is locked by big corp, Facebook, your company, whatever, personal identifiable information that is being sold by others. They are stolen en masse. Yahoo has had big breaks, Expedia, lots and lots of organizations there. We also have this problem is that, we really need to give our spouse the ability to look at our bank account, and the bank says, no, you can't do that, but you do it anyhow, so you give her him your password. This is called ambient authority. We're handling it terribly. And then later, the service shuts down. There's over 100,000 people that are stateless. The states where they were born will not tell you anything about their citizenship. I worked for 5 years in an MBA program in a college that no longer exists. My students, in a way, are digital refugees with their degrees, because there's no organization now behind to say that they spent the $50,000 and did all the work that was necessary to get that degree. We also have many contexts: family, friends, different communities, churches, ethnic, lifestyle, special interests, and institutions, employment, school. So lots of different contexts for these credentials. And there are way too many of these. They all have an identifier. Your family calls you by your name or by your relationship, like my aunt. Friends from different eras might have a different name for me. Different relationships, roommate. Different communities will have usernames, email addresses, and institutions will have all of these different contexts. Identifiers are what is used to connect those contexts. So it's you and the name that friends use for you, work uses for you, institutions, and that then lets you be able to communicate at a distance to society. These intermediaries have wedged in here, and it's become unmanageable. It just doesn't work because it ended up being for their interest rather than for yours. So what we decided, credentials was sort of the first thing to tackle. Within credentials, the next thing is this identifier, because that's really where the root, you might say, of a credential is. So let's solve the problem with identifiers. Part of the thing there is URLs are leased to you by your DNS provider. Phone numbers are loaned to you and often are easily ported away. Government-issued identities are misused commercially, or by other parties that shouldn't be using them. And management of identities and identifiers is really hard for a non-technical organization, so they outsource it to somebody else. They say, we're going to do it with this federation, or we're going to let Facebook do this. This results in a lot of costs, data portability issues, obviously data privacy issues, and some real harm that this information is available in these big honeypots that attackers can go after. So, we have the issuer, holder, and verifier. We have this centralized name system. The identifiers are kind of leased, loaned by the issuer to these parties. Let's fix this. So what we want to do is create many identifiers for person, organizations, or things. We want them to be portable. We want them not to depend on a centralized authority. We want to use the lessons from cryptography to protect those, and we want to enable privacy and the data portability of the information and trust. So what we invented was something called the Decentralized Identifier. If you walk by me later, the URL's on here. It's globally unique. It's highly available, it's cryptographically verifiable, and it has no central authority. So instead of using this California driver's license identifier, we have another way of doing it. In this case, we replace that centralized control with these things called decentralized identifiers, and then we leverage blockchain and some non-blockchain technologies such as distributed hash tables to do the decentralization, so that it isn't one party that can take it away from you. You basically have it for your lifetime or as long as you wish to use it, which also might mean you might want to dispose of it. What does it look like? It looks like this. Hopefully you will never see these as a user. It'll be abstracted in the same way that today largely people don't remember their telephone number or what their IP address is. They just basically go, what's John's in my phone number in my book, or can I have John text me in my text? I'm not going to memorize their phone number or an IP address. It's very rare you see those on the internet. Decentralized identifiers are for individuals and allow for self-sovereignty, but they're useful for other things. Organizations can have decentralized identifiers. Things can have decentralized identifier. I can have a decentralized identifier for my phone for various IoT devices, home devices. And they're registered on a blockchain or other decentralized network, and they're managed by these digital wallets. These are some of the DID verifiable credential implementations to date. There's my Bitcoin reference one, Blockstack, some Ethereum ones, IPFS, and then this ecosystem here in the Netherlands knows a lot about the sovereign DID implementation, and there's also Veris1. There's over 40 in that list. So what this does is we're basically putting all these things together. We have a decentralized identifier, we have this metadata, we have the claims about the subject, we have the issuer and information that allows that not to be counterfeited, and then we have a verification process by which we can have a biometric or other thing that says you are who you say you are. So these are organizations that are committed to DID's verifiable credentials, a large number of them. It's probably twice this size now. I've got to kind of come up with a new way to organize this slide. There's also increasing government support. So in the United States, the Homeland Security's Department of Science and Technology has said future projects, if you want to be paid by Homeland Security or whatever for various projects, for goods, et cetera, you're going to have a DID and a verifiable credential. In the EU, there is the new European Self-Sovereignty Identity Framework. In Canada, there is the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework that are both self-sovereign. So governments are very interested in this, and they're doing some really amazing work. I've heard good things about New Zealand. I know Switzerland is talking in this area, Taiwan, but the big three right now are the EU, and in particular, the interest here in Netherlands is high, and the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. I'm going to kind of intersect now between architecture and philosophy. So what this means is that there are sort of two major tracks of self-sovereign identity. There is what I like to call the less identity side, which stands for legally enabled self-sovereign identity, but to a certain extent, when you think about it from a government perspective, regulatory perspective, a corporate perspective, let's not have more identity, let's actually have less. What is the minimum necessary to give you the right to be able to do the things that you need to be able to do with that inherent dignity and respect in the world? It has minimal disclosure, it has your control, it has the proofs, and it needs to be legally enabled in the different processes you do in your social contract. But we also still need to have the trustless identity forms. I hate the word trustless, but I can't seem to get away with it because the world wants to use this in the blockchain community. It's really trust minimized, but it supports things like anonymity, web of trust, censorship resistance, and it helps defend human rights versus powerful actors, whether or not that's a government or a multinational corporation or something really actively malicious like a mafia. Tim Bouma coined this term. He said, I want my identity to be digital, good, and better, but in the end, I want my identity to be less than the real me. So that really is kind of the first principle of self-sovereign identity that he's expressing there in a legal context. I say that less identity works really well for high trust environments with real-world identity verification, with trust frameworks, privacy and accountability, and government acceptance of this. But let's talk about the other side. So 1.1 billion people have no legal identity, including tens of millions of stateless refugees. I'll go all the way back to Plato. So tyranny naturally arises out of democracy. And the most aggravated form of tyranny and slavery out of the most extreme form of liberty. And we're seeing this today. This cycle has happened over the last 3,000 years, and we're seeing signs of it today. So just because we have a great government today does not mean we'll have a great government tomorrow. Which leads to, why do I care about self-sovereign identity, and why did I come to the Netherlands? A week ago Sunday was the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. So I attended a very moving ceremony in Amsterdam where the Amsterdam Prime Minister apologized. Now this is a really big deal. For 75 years the government has never apologized for their role. What he said was, when authority became a threat, our government agencies failed as guardians of law and security. Now that the last survivors are still among us, I apologize today on behalf of the government for our government actions then. So this was a week and a couple of days ago, and he put the wreath on the monument. So what went wrong? Why is he apologizing? What happened? So more Jews died, both in absolute percentage and in absolute number, in the Netherlands over Germany, France, and other countries. More people died. Part of this was because the Nazis took over civil administration. So they basically said, oh, this is a Germanic-style organization. We're just going to put our leadership in all these positions. We're still going to have the civil servants do things, but we're going to run things. So what went wrong? Well, it's interesting. So in 1932, J.L. Lentz, who had been involved in civil service for over a decade, became head of the National Inspectorate of Population Registers in the Dutch civil service. So the 1930s was a very rough time. The world was in the grip of the Great Depression. The efficiency of the Dutch civil service ensured that all citizens had access to basic services. And it was one of the best in Europe during the Depression. He was given the task to promote more unity in the population registers and all of this. So by 1936, he helped establish a decree that every resident in the Netherlands must have a personal identity card in the civil archives about them and how it worked, and that these archives needed to be stored in a single office in each region. So in this case, there were civil archives in Amsterdam for the Holland region. Lentz won a royal award for this effort. He did a great job. It solved a lot of problems. These centralized civil registries were one of the first targets captured by the Nazis, and they were considered a very valuable asset by them. Almost immediately after capitulation, Lentz was asked by the Nazis to create a very difficult to forge national identity card, which he did. He literally wrote the book on personal identity, and in particular in there I thought interesting was the proof of inclusion in the population ledger. Boy, doesn't that sound like some of the stuff we're working on? So the resistance in Holland was very active and very powerful. They began to forge these identity cards. But the problem was these identity cards could be compared against the civil archive. So somebody would come along with a forged identity card, and the police would say, I don't know if this is an identity card, put him in jail, walk to the archives and go, is this? Oh, there's not a J on here, and there's a J on here. Clearly, you're, Time to send you off. There were civil servants who were willing to falsify records, and so they would also forge the records in the civil registry in addition to the papers that the police would look at. But it was a racing game. They would change the identity papers. Lentz got better at anti-counterfeiting, better at proofs, and they would have to redo this. So by 1943, these archives became the target for the resistance. So the Dutch resistance in 28th of March 1943, drugged the guards, dragged them out, and tried to bomb the facility. But unfortunately, only 10% of the facility was burned. 15%, excuse me, after the bombing. And then later, like 2 years later, they persuaded the Allies to bomb it, and it was another 10%. So most of the records were still there. Meanwhile, in France, the Vichy government also assisted in deportation of Jews and other undesirables, but the administration of their system was really being run by the French government at a lot of sort of managerial levels. The Vichy government refused to continue to arrest Jews on large scale, but also importantly, the Nazis did not control the civil archives, and the French civil archive system was really not very good. But as a consequence of this is that even though there were twice as many Jews in France, only 23% of them were murdered in the Nazi death camps or other forms of execution, whereas 75% in Holland died. 75%. That's incredibly, considering all those, the guy who did 80,000 identity cards that were fake, and the work in the civil archives and trying to burn the records, only 25% escaped. So this is a living history here in the Netherlands. I went to the Holocaust Memorial, and I was fortunate enough to go with lunch, and I met with a child of two survivors of Auschwitz. His mother had been rounded up by using this data in what is known as a razzia, where the government would say, "There's a strike over here. We don't like this strike. Go get these people. Deport them." His father did flee to Utrecht, but ultimately was betrayed, and he doesn't know the facts, but the son believes that they were betrayed by the Nazis using civil data to kind of a primitive social network analysis to find the friends and the cousins and whatever, and to find out where he was hiding. So, lessons for today. Despite great trust in the government, we never might know what happens tomorrow. Also, centralized architectures and proofs can be used for both good and evil. They protected people in the 30s. They were used by evil by the Nazis. This is my opinion. I believe that this living history from the survivors of World War II is why the Dutch citizens and the Netherlands government are so supportive of the human rights aspects of GDPR. When I started hearing about GDPR and talking with more experts about it, I would often hear that the Netherlands was a lead in this. Why? Well, some of it was because there is these living memories, just like this child of survivors. And I think it's also why self-sovereign identity is on the agenda here before it is in many other countries. Why we're at this event is because someplace there's a living memory. However, remembrance is still needed. As the Prime Minister said, as the last ones are left, we need to apologize. The passing of old generations and also use of fake news in various organizations having an impact on our ability to remember it. I've talked to a number of Dutch citizens, smart people, know a lot of history. They didn't know this story. I was asked after I posted this on Twitter, so how can we be heroes in a world where false identification cards and baptismal certificates and all the different things that were done in different parts of the world to protect the Jews by valiant people, how can we do that anymore? How can the honest to good superhero be in a world where identity makes them visible and vulnerable? So I say that there's still a need for trustless solutions. Nationalism tribalism, xenophobia is on the rise around the world. We see it in Russia, Brazil, Great Britain, Poland, Turkey. I could go on. And the normalization of this xenophobia encourages violations of human rights. We've already seen academics, critics, journalists, in addition to the more ordinary forms of xenophobia of Muslim or Jew or whatever, but also other forms, transgender, et cetera, have all been targeted. But it's worse now because facial recognition is becoming adopted worldwide. These new dangers require new ways to protect human rights. But we still need both. Netherlands has a high trust society. In general, the government is trusted by its citizens, and the citizens are trusted by the government. You've got something really great here. We want this. But it isn't true everywhere. Another aspect of less identity is that's where the money is. So if you, even though self-sovereign identity came from trustless roots, it's really been driven in the last couple of years by major advancements in the communities that are working on legally enabled self-sovereign identity, or for projects in commerce that will be, allowed or supported by governments. And so that's where a lot of the development work is going. It's where a lot of the best projects are. But I ask this community and other communities, as these standards emerge, as these projects emerge, don't lock out the trustless solutions. They serve a different need. Hopefully we'll never need them, but they serve a different need than being served by less identity. So we need to support both those sides. I will close with this thought. The identity community needs what I'm calling a for remembrance. This is not an English word, came out of the air, but a forward remembrance. We need to, on one hand, remember the past. So there was sculptor Gerrit van der Veen, who forged 80,000 civil records and identity cards. There was also author and painter William Arundus and 11 others who were found guilty and were executed for trying to, let's see, this is on the, what is now the Zoo Cafe, which is the old civil archives. And on the 27th of March, that's when they tried to burn it. We need to salute those who defended the defenseless in World War II, who eased sufferings at all genocides past, and fought against discrimination and totalitarianism. We need to remember them, but we also need to remember those who are today at the front of this. So they're the protesters in Hong Kong. There are people trying to investigate what in the heck is going on in Xinjiang in the re-education. Are those really concentration camps? The government of Zambia, a little small third world nation in Africa, is taking the Burmese country, and in particular the leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, to court here in The Hague to demand protection for the Rohingya. What in heck does Rohingya have to do with Gambia? No. The Gambian government has said, wait a second, this happened next door in Rwanda. We don't want to see this happen again, even if it's another country. So they're actively pursuing in the Hague court, trying to stop that. We want to support the people who are protecting immigrant children in the U.S., protecting us against Cambridge Analytica-like attacks in this year's elections. Note, there's a lot of elections this year. And to all of those who are protecting minority communities such as gays, transsexuals, and more. So we want to salute those who are defending the vulnerable today and in the future. So I encourage that on the 27th of March, I would love to see, a gathering at the Amsterdam Zoo building that was the Civil Archives at like sunset, and give a moment of silence to remember the past and the future of this, what's been happening and what has happened in the data community. So let me know if you go there. Thank you.
We got some questions here from the audience. I noticed one straight away. How scared are you, and what is the trend over time?
Yeah.
You didn't sound very scared, but is that true?
Well, I didn't really talk about what's going on in other part of the world. I mean, I do believe that there's a new polarity happening. Polarity is something humans have a tendency to do, and it's unfortunate. But we look at the Chinese social credit system at one extreme. But I would also put the very commercial-oriented ADHAR system. So we probably can all go, oh, this Chinese social credit thing, ooh, that's terrible. It doesn't, whatever. You actually talk to the Chinese and they go, well, it's working for me. I'm getting faster passes. I'm getting discounts. I'm getting all these wonderful things. Why do I care? But it's a little bit harder when we talk about ADHAR. So ADHAR was commissioned by the Indian government without a lot of law and regulations around it. They basically said, commercial company, please do this, with some very great results. They say that they've saved $12 billion on a $1 billion investment. Like, that's a great return on investment. But the problem is the most vulnerable have become even more vulnerable. So we have, grandmother who, as she's getting older, her skin's getting thinner, and she's getting cataracts in her eyes because of bad health. And the response of the civil administrator when the biometric scan and the finger scan doesn't work is, sorry, can't do anything for you, go home. And that's where we have to have this respect and dignity, because he's the administrator. Even if he's at the bottom of a tree of hierarchy, he ought to have the authority and have the respect and dignity of this person before them to help solve this problem for this person. But instead, it's kind of, oh, that's what the rules say. The computer says you're not real.
Computer says no.
Yeah.
So what I hear is you're scared on behalf of those who can't.
Correct. And I worry that that side is growing. So
yeah. You can see them on the screen here. If that's a little small, they're also in huge letters behind you. Is there a question that... I like this one. What's on your button?
So this is Ask Me About Decentralized Identifiers. So this is a tech conference. So there's a URL on here, and I'll be glad to share with you this particular technology. It's not the be-all, end-all. Self-sovereign identity is much, much bigger, and the principles are much, much bigger. But this is our starting point. And if you want to get involved, either as a developer, or we just met in Amsterdam last week, and it's part of the W3C, and then we're meeting in Buenos Aires next month to do a sort of a group of people, both tech and law and regulatory, in Buenos Aires to kind of tackle some of these problems. So if you're interested in any of those types of things, please talk to me. I would like to talk about the issuers in this SSI ecosystem. Should they be curated? So I have some history here. So I'm the co-author of the TLS standard. I really helped establish the early CA system. So in 1992 or so, I named VeriSign, ran their website, set up some of their original equipment and such, which was the first major certificate authority. The idea then was, you like VeriSign, you like their policies, you should use that certificate authority. But you like, the Sierra Club's certificate authority, because they have some different standards and they exclude different people based on their things. But you like the Sacramento Business certificate authority, which has a different set of standards. So you choose which one of these CAs you would do. But what ended up happening was two things. One was the industry consolidated. VeriSign went out and bought like 30 or 40 of these. But also national governments and other people said, we can't have you have a certificate authority. We have to have one for our country. So there's a Kyrgyzstan certificate authority. And I've been pointing out for several years, why do I have to trust it? It's because the browsers insisted. So what happened, we ended up with this thing. The idea was, I don't think in 92 we were talking decentralized, but we were talking about distributed. We had this ideal that this was going to work, but people figured out how to re-centralize it. So basically there are 3 companies, you might even argue just 2 companies in the world that decide who you will trust online, because it's who they will allow to have CAs in their browser. So that lesson to the self-sovereign identity system is, no, you should not have exclusionary curation that basically says you cannot be an issuer. But I also think there should be voluntary curation. There ought to be more kinds of CAs issuers that can offer different things. I'll give you a specific example of how this might work. Your driver's license, in an organization within a government, rather than necessarily taking tests of drivers, why don't you issue what the rules are and be able to have 4 or 5 issuers who do the driving test for you and what the rules are for those to do so that you don't have to go to a centralized place to get your driving test. You actually have this other place. Now, what's really cool about then is that then there might be some insurance companies that go, oh, wow, if you'll take this extra little test that this company will offer, we'll give you a 10% discount on your insurance. So I think there's some ways that, by having a little bit of design and curation and ability to have some flexibility there, that we can create some pretty amazing systems.
So, no curation, but good system around it. How about the next question?
So let's talk about self-sovereign identity for things. A lot of people are observing the challenges of not only the home, the Alexa in the home or a thermometer in the home, and obviously it offers some great utility, but these, in an odd way, these things are also rented. They have keys in them that allow Google and Amazon and whatever to use them. We'll use them whatever way they want. They can control that. So there is a movement to not only solve that problem at that level, but like everything, a shipping container that starts in Wuhan in the coronavirus area that then needs to be shipped into Hong Kong and maybe needs to have a certification of fumigation or whatever is protected. And then it's going to go to Singapore, and then it's going to go to British Columbia, and then it's going to go to Europe or the United States. There's a little box on that carton that basically says the fumigation was done at this point by these people. So we want to have these physical things, but we also don't want them to be controlled. There are technologies by which, rather than having the centralized authority be in the box, that we can basically, either as an individual in our home or a corporation in this, basically produce these special kinds of proofs that create new sets of keys and authorizations for that device to do things that are under your control rather than the manufacturer's control or some centralized network like Amazon.
And my guess is here you could also bring in some digital twin activity to make sure that the physical stuff and the digital stuff, so even if you are able to hack one, you can't get to the other, so there will be a mismatch.
Now, we do need some legal support here, so in a sense this is an augmentation of existing things. So we need to, have support to say that, we are giving limited agency, the agency to say yes or no on things, or to give certain kinds of information to those people that we say are authorized to receive it. That's not clear in a lot of our regulatory structures, where it has to be a human button that pushes a button.
Yeah, we are the weakest link all the time. Yeah, we got time for, I think, one more question. If we could get the master question list back.
To what extent do you believe SSI infringes on the sovereignty of nation states? What are the positive
and you've got 1 minute 40 to answer that. Good luck.
So I encourage voluntary association. It's under the UN Charter of Human Rights. I really would like to see more voluntary communities with boundaries. If you know Ostrom, in the first principle of Ostrom's protection of the commons, says you need to have a boundary for a successful management of commons. So I really like those, and we can learn from these, but I think it's a little too early to try to say, oh, well, we're going to have a global citizenship. Because when we get up to that scale, there are a lot of social and human and voting and attack surfaces and things of that nature. So I can protect your community, I can help you protect your community of hundreds to thousands to maybe tens of thousands. But as we get into millions and billions, we start having these adversarial approaches and effects and other things that we don't understand, but we might be able to learn if we can solve the problem for 10,000, 10,000 glass craftsmen in Germany and Belgium and Netherlands that have some kind of uniform standards, some things, maybe some voluntary income between just their voluntary association, et cetera. We could do that with self-sovereign identity now. So I encourage you, as you're looking at these different projects, how can you find some population, some group of people that, have authority involved in what it is that they do, but is smaller and bounded in some fashion by mutuality.
Fabulous. You're hanging around for the rest of the afternoon, I believe?
Yes, I am.
So you'll be here for lunch and break and more questions.
Correct.
So if you want to know more about what's on the badge, about decentralized identifiers, or you want to join up on the 27th of March to have a minute of silence. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been my pleasure. Mr. Christopher Allen.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.